everyone and welcome to the Belgian Color channel, in which we'll be speaking about technology, software engineering and everything related. In this very first video we'll be speaking about serverless, what it is and how it can help you with your project or with your clients. If you don't have any technological background, it's perfectly fine. We'll explain those concepts with very high-level explanation, and if you have any question left, feel free to submit them in the comments below. So let's say you just developed a software that computes a matching score between two lovers based on their first name, because yes, this is very scientific. This software to be accessible to your targeted audience, for example here teenagers, has to be deployed in some way. Your first option will be to buy a freaking rack full of servers. It would be very expensive because you would have to handle things like the cooling system, cable management, stuff like this. It's not something you want if it's just software for fun. Another possibility is to rent a virtual machine in the cloud. This virtual machine, you won't have to think about what I've just said before, but you still have to patch the OS. For example, if you use Linux, you have to patch it. Or lastly, you can just push your application to a cloud provider to run your application, but without the need to patch a virtual machine and to manage it. But all the solutions will make you pay even if your application is not used by anyone, which is maybe not what you want. And that's when serverless comes to play. So you may have heard of serverless as function as a service or lambdas. It's the same. The idea is that you have a cloud provider, the serverless platform, you push your code to the platform and it will run it only when needed, when triggered. So what is a trigger? A trigger can be something simple, like for example an HTTP endpoint, or it can be something more complex like a chatbot or any infrastructure event, like for example disk full. But is it simple to develop an application for serverless? Well, it depends. It depends if you're already used to web services or even better to microservices, because you will have a better time to split your application into functions. If you are more used to large code base running on a single machine, it can be harder than if you are already used to web services. So the benefits are multiple. One, you only pay if it's used. If nobody is using your application, you don't pay anything. Most cloud providers are offering a free tier of service to test your own application. So you may not have to pay anything even if you test your own application. So to resume, no traffic, no cost. Two, when people would use your application, you wouldn't have to scale manually the number of servers. A serverless platform would scale it for you proportionally to the traffic. And third, you only pay for the resources you use. So for example, if you have a smaller function, a lighter function, which use less CPU, for example, you would pay less than for another. It means that you can identify which function may have to be improved to cost less. However, there are some caveats. First, when I say it's free if nobody is calling you, is using your application, you may have to be sure that, for example, bots on the internet don't spam your application non-stop, or otherwise you may have to pay something. And even if nobody is calling your application, it's possible that the code that you store itself would cost a bit. So it's very few cents, but if your code base is multiple terabytes of code, it's something to consider. Another caveat is the fact that a function really called will enter in a cold start state. It means that to run, it will take something like 1 to 2 seconds to run. So if your application is really cold, it's something to consider, because Maybe you're okay with the fact that your customer will have something like 1 to 2 seconds more of waiting before having their response. But if your application has to be super efficient all the time, it's something to consider. One solution, for example, some cloud providers have, like Azure, Microsoft Azure, is the fact that you can specify a pre-warmed up instance that stays warmed all time, which means that if you have a request coming at any point, you will have an instance ready to answer it. And lastly but not the least, there is some kind of, but very slight vendor lock-in. Why do I say slight? Because the code inside the function is always the same. If you are coding in Python, Python in AWS or Azure is the same. It's okay. But the configuration around the type of triggers you can use may be different from one provider to another. In conclusion, serverless would be very useful for new project or for project with an already services-oriented architecture. So it's something to consider. But for older application, which is not split it into multiple services, it may be a little bit tricky and maybe not worth the time. Secondly, benchmarking is king because you have SLA, but it's always good to see if the cold start is okay for your application. If you change a lot of function and you have a lot of cold start, it can be impactful. So make sure to really test your application. And my last recommendation would be to be very disciplined on how you manage your code base, your distributed code base, because you want to be able to see quickly which function modification can impact another. Well, thank you guys. If you have any suggestion for another topic, make sure to comment below. If you have any question, comment below and make sure to hit that subscribe button. I appreciate it. Thanks.